Mr. Reardon here. This video will walk you through one possible approach to the third prompt in the Chapter 5 college level synthesis unit on education. Just a reminder, this is one possible approach, right? This is not necessarily an approach you have to take. And I really want this essay to be an opportunity for you to be creative and for you to make an argument that you want to make using sources that you're interested in. And I want you to explore some ideas that you find worth exploring. I don't want you to feel like you have to follow this particular structure. It's just one approach, really designed for those who aren't quite sure what they'd like to argue and need some ideas to get started. Speaking of ideas, you by now, if you're watching this in class, have uploaded your education synthesis essay thinking sheet to Schoology. You have probably talk to a table group and revise that a little bit based on your table group conversation if you're in class. At this point, you'll be listening to this video, and you might be adding some things to your videos, to your you'll be adding some things to your thinking sheet, making some revisions, and then if you want, not required, but if you want, you might put together an outline as well before you actually start writing the final draft of the paper. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. As this is a synthesis essay, we'll naturally be starting with a hook. If you want to start some other way on your own essay, right, I'm okay with that. You can be flexible, but this example will be holding pretty close to the synthesis structures that we've been learning in class. Again, I really think you should tell a story. This is my sort of default hook when I'm thinking about these essay prompts. Do you know someone whose educational experience is very different from yours due to some aspect of educational inequality, right? Maybe someone who lives in a different place, someone who lives in a school that is less well resourced than Pali, right? Do you have a story of someone for whom this is the case? Maybe it's your story. Maybe you went to a school that was not nearly as well resourced at some point in the past, and you have a story of like the contrast between Pali and that place, right? If you could really tell a story, or you could just really engage in a vivid contrast between Pali and a place like that that has fewer resources. This would be like really adding a lot of imagery, right? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like, right? What does it look like? What's the experience of a or what would be the experience of going into a school that is really strapped for resources, and how does that contrast to Pali? Alrighty, so exigence. You would then, I think you should really bring in this idea from the prompt, right? This that there exists a narrative that despite race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, or creed, American society provides everyone the same education, right? The same opportunities, the same. I wrote education here, but what it really should say is opportunity to achieve the American dream if they prioritize education and practice diligence, right? Like this is the narrative, right? And then I imagine the most common perspective is going to be, right, that no, this is not really completely accurate. And so you would then contrast that narrative with the reality for some students, whatever students you plan to talk about in your thesis. Now, of course, I think the most common group of people that we'll be talking about is low-income students, though, of course, educational inequality also absolutely impacts students of color, right? So again, you're engaging in some contrast here in both your hook and your exigence. And then, of course, we have a thesis statement here. Now, while in an abstract way there does exist equality of opportunity for students to find success in public education systems that in turn help them to find success later in life, there are at least two reasons why low-income students and non-white students in particular are not served um, by public education institutions in ways that give them true equality of opportunity. Norms in public school classrooms that give students with economic means greater advantages, one, and unconscious bias on the part of both staff and students at many schools. Alrighty, so this sample essay here uses something called a quadrant thesis, which is something I have not gone over with you before. So I'm going to go over this right now. A quadrant thesis looks a bit like a Punnett square from biology. Essentially, um, the quadrant thesis statement allows you to take, for example, in this case, take two ideas. So in this case, two groups of people, and cross them with two other ideas, or in this case, two experiences or realities of society to create four ideas, right? And we said here that there are two groups of people being affected: low-income students and non-white students in particular, right? And then there are two structures that are restricting their true equality of opportunity. And so those are um, the um, those are the those are the norms that exist in public school classrooms that give students with economic means greater advantages. And those are that's unconscious bias on the part of staff and other students. Right. So when we cross these ideas, low-income students experience income privileging structures, like that is all things that are easier for students who have money in school. Participating in sports, just being able to print assignments, being able to get assignments done at home, and knowing you're going to have a quiet space and time to do them. Right. Then but income privileging structures also affect non-white students, right? And these ideas are connected because in the aggregate, white families have a lot more wealth than non-white families in this country. This here is actually a link. So if you go to the document that I'm looking at right now, you can click on that and go to this link here and get some evidence for this argument. And then Right. So naturally, non-white students also experience these same things, or naturally cannot do these same things that low-income students, regardless of race, can't do. So you can make those connections. And then unconscious bias, right? So unconscious bias, we're now in paragraph 2, first evidence unit. There's this idea of low expectations that Sir Ken Robinson really brought up. It's not something that we really think very much about, but it may exist, especially in some places. I'm thinking of maybe more rural areas where adults and other students might have low expectations of someone who is low income. And then you can then say, well, just like in the previous row here, you can say this might be true of low-income students, but it's going to be particularly true for um, non-white students, right? Because of this idea of unconscious bias. There's a lot of research to prove that even in the most well-meaning liberal people who are not people of color, right, there can be unconscious bias against people of color, things they're just not aware of. And there's this need to be really aware on the part of both adults and teenagers in a school setting that this kind of unconscious bias is a thing and needs to be actively fought. And so you can read about that again at this link here and use some of that evidence if you'd like to make this argument in your paper. So I take this quadrant, these ideas, and now I'm going to bring them down into paragraphs. And so that's what's going to happen down here. So here we go. So of course we have our introduction, first evidence unit in the first body paragraph. Present this abstract idea that equality of opportunity exists, right? It's true. This is a common argument heard from some. It's true that there are no explicit legal systems. De jure is the term we often use for this. There are no explicit legal systems that prevent low-income students or non-white students from attending schools or earning the same grades or going scholarships or playing sports or anything. Like, that doesn't exist. That would be considered not only wrong, but highly illegal in our current society. That would be, racial discrimination. Not okay. That doesn't exist. Um, but there are a lot of de facto models, and this is our second evidence unit, right? There are a lot of de facto models of inequality or de facto phenomena in our society that lead to inequality. These are structures that no one talks about. And so you could use this another outside source I provided you with that could help you to argue that de facto models of inequality do exist. And so therefore, this is why this warrants the claim that actually there is in fact no that warrants the claim that there is actually, in fact, systematic inequality, even if there isn't legally sanctioned inequality. So once you've gotten this out of the way, we can actually jump into these paragraphs. Evidence Unit 1. Now we're in the quadrant, right? This was not in the quadrant. This was just sort of a paragraph that helps to defend your the relevance of your argument. It warrants your argument. Now this paragraph actually jumps in the quadrants. You should explain and provide evidence for the idea that students with more money will have an easier time in school, right? And I'll give you a list of things here that a student might be able to do more easily if they have money. Participation in sports or activities like field trips. Just something simple like printing out assignments, right? Often teachers require one printout assignments. But if you don't have a printer at home, if you don't have a computer that can connect to the printer at home, if you can't afford expensive ink or toner cartridges, right? That's a socioeconomic systematic issue that has to be addressed. Right, access to technology or the internet. We're fortunate at Powley that any student who wants a Chromebook can get one. That's not true in most places. Not everyone has internet at home. Also, transportation, right? Can you even get to school? How far are you from school? Is there a bus system? If there is a school bus system, do you have to get on the bus at 6:15 a.m. in order to make it for an 8:20 start, right? Like, there's all these inequalities here that you could talk about. You could maybe just focus on one or two in your essay. And then let's see. Second evidence unit for this second body paragraph. Explain how these then, we're jumping over to this next part of the quadrant. I guess this should really say paragraph 2, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, paragraph 3, right? We're in this quadrant now, right? It's not only is all of this true, low-income students would have these issues, but also this is particularly true for non-white families in general. And so you would then make that argument here in this second evidence unit. Third body paragraph, you could then provide a definition of unconscious bias, and I gave you a resource above right here that can help you define that, right? You can present this idea that there was this idea in the past that working class children might not benefit from public education that's funded by taxation from changing education paradigms. And you could, right, and then you might have to admit, this may be true in a lot of American schools today, that there could be unconscious bias against very low income people, but there is absolutely unconscious bias. There's lots of research to support that there's unconscious bias against people who are non-white. You would need, and you could use the article above again that I just pointed out in the fourth quadrant up there to make this argument. And then conclusion, I give you an idea here for a conclusion that's sort of beyond the typical simple argument conclusion. You could talk about the difference between equality and equity, right? And talk about, what a solution might look like to some of these equity issues, some of the, the issues that are preventing all students from having access to the American dream through education. Now, there's an image here that can help you to understand this, and the image is down here. Feel free to take this out of your essay or take this out of this document, and you might have to like screenshot and crop if you can't pull it directly out, and then drop it in your own essay and refer to it explicitly in the text of your essay. Right, that would be an interesting way to conclude and sort of bring this whole conversation full circle and back to this main idea of the American dream. If you use the image, of course, you need to cite it, and you can see I've left you the link here that you can use to cite the image parenthetically. So let's see. Of course, now this essay was arguing against this idea that education is the great equalizer. If you want to argue for that, you're going to need to find some evidence for that. I'm sure there might exist some evidence, but I think it's going to be harder for you to make that argument. There's just because there's so much agreement that education is in fact not the great equalizer among among academic circles. Now, also, I did not bring in the inequitable experience of LGBT students in this particular argument, but you could, of course, that's an option you could do. And so you'd need to modify this model, maybe change the entries in the quadrants to find an experience that, for example, both low-income students and LGBT students, or maybe non-white students and LGBT students, for example, social isolation in a school that's respectively mostly straight or mostly white, mostly not Black and Latino, right? That you have to come up with ideas like that those two groups share, so you can then make the argument that that this applies to both groups, and educational inequity or education therefore isn't quite allowing all groups, regardless of the extent of their privilege, to have the same opportunity to achieve the American dream. Also, as I said, none of these texts that you had to read for the Fishbowl touched on the concept of unconscious bias. That was presented only in Between the World and Me. And since that was optional, I imagine many people did not read it. And so, again, if you're going to use that argument, you're going to need to do a little additional research, but I've given you some articles that can help you to make this argument. All right, that's all I need to give you for this prompt. Of course, any questions can be emailed to me, hreardon, REARDON, @posd.org. Bye-bye.